Thank you very much. I want to thank the Ananta Center for this opportunity. I also find the initiative a timely one because there is an imperative need to understand trade policy, especially among the general population. Trade policy can often be highly technical, esoteric, and I hope my talk will go at least some way in explaining some of the basic tenets which underpin India's trade policy. So let me begin by saying that India is a sui generis country. Now, what do I mean by that? I think what I mean by that is that we display characteristics with regard to India. Now, keep that in mind when I try to talk to you about the two fundamental assumptions which really form the backbone of India's trade policy. The first one is what I choose to call the Mahatma Gandhi Litmus test, and it's a very simple test, which is that every Indian policy maker, and every Indian trade negotiator, every Indian diplomat, and indeed every Indian citizen should be concerned about this. We have something like 300 million people, if not more, who live in poverty. I don't want to get into the definition of poverty, extreme poverty, but suffice it to say that these 300 million people live in extremely miserable conditions. Now, whatever we do by way of trade policy, by way of decisions, I think it goes without saying that this should not leave the 300 million people worse off than what they are already. And that is the least that you can do as a policymaker and a decision maker. And that is why I call it the Gandhi Litmus test. The second basic underlying assumption with regard to India's trade policy is that it flows from the first, which is that the government of India, when it looks at trade policy and is negotiating trade agreements, seeks to have or acquire as much policy space as possible. What do I mean by that? It essentially means that when you subject yourself to international trade agreements, you are trying to keep the room for maneuver as much as possible so that if you need to intervene and if you need to take actions to safeguard the interests of these 300 million people, then it should be possible for the government of India to do so without attracting any sanction from the international community. So I hope this much is clear to you. I needed to make this clear because there is an impression that India is often a naysayer when it comes to trade policy, multilateral negotiations, and our approach to international negotiations. I would argue that this so-called naysaying, if you like, has got to do with the Gandhi Litmus test. It's got to do with the fact that India is sui generis. Let me then address very briefly the multilateral trading system embodied by the WTO as it stands today, because India's trade policy cannot function in isolation. It has to happen in the context of the multilateral trading system. The WTO faces an existential crisis. There is no secret there. Everybody knows that. The result is that the multilateral trading system, which was unified, which lent security and predictability to India's trade policy, has become fragmented. And it has led to unpredictability and uncertainty. So let me give you examples. One of the fundamental features of WTO was that trade should happen on the basis of MFN, which is the most favored nation rule, which is that, to give you an example for those of you who may not know, if India decides to import shirts from United States at 10% customs duty or tariff, as it is called in the WTO, India is then obliged to extend the same 10% to every other WTO member, whether you like them or not. This is MFN. And this essentially meant that India in the past benefited from the negotiations which happened between US and EU, US and Canada, US and Japan, and so on. That MFN is under an unprecedented assault. Not just because of President Donald Trump, but also because of his predecessors, because of actions that other countries have taken as well. So regardless of politics, it is now true that most of the international trade that happens now does not happen on MFN basis. It happens on the basis of what is known as preferential trade agreements or regional free trade agreements. So India stands at a disadvantage because if you take the three major economies of the world, which is United States, EU, and China, they constitute something like 45 to 50% of global GDP and 40 to 50% of global trade. The fact of the matter is, India does not have any FTA with any of these three major economies of the world. The only FTA we have today is with ASEAN, we have it with Japan, we have it with Korea. But then we have a $100 billion trade with the United States, we have a $100 billion trade with EU, we have a $100 billion trade with the Gulf cooperation countries, and we have a $100 billion trade with China. And we do not have an FTA with any of these. So I would say that one of the main challenges facing India today is how do we sign these FTAs so that our exporters can get what is known as a preferential tariff in order to be able to export in large quantities to these major economies. Bear in mind that India's current GDP is $2.7 trillion. Almost 45 to 50% of this is international trade. So if India is to become a $5 trillion economy, then we need to double India's trade. You need to double your exports, you need to double your imports. So I would begin by saying that is the most important challenge that India faces. In parallel, what is happening in the WTO is that we are moving away from multilateral negotiations to what is known as plurilateral negotiations. So that is another challenge for India because India is not part of these plurilateral negotiations in the WTO. We are not part of the negotiations on electronic commerce. We are not part of the negotiations on investment facilitation, and we are not part of the negotiations on domestic regulation in services. So that is the other challenge, and India needs to take some important decisions in the near future. So that is the second challenge. I think flowing from all this is the real challenge that India has in terms of its economic diplomacy. And let me explain what India's objectives are when it comes to Indian diplomats, Indian trade diplomats. The first important objective is that we need open markets for our goods and services. Now, this is at a time when protectionism is gaining ground in the West, and there is a problem with the multilateral trading system, as I explained. So the fundamental primordial objective of India's trade policy is to keep markets abroad open for our goods and services. The second important objective of our economic and trade diplomacy is that we need liberal immigration regimes abroad for our youth. India still has a number of people who go abroad, and they either go for education, they either go for skill development, or they go for seeking employment opportunities. For example, I was India's ambassador in Bahrain when the 6 Gulf countries, which is Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, they host as many as 8 million people from India. And these 8 million people remit $40 billion. So India finds it extremely important to have these countries which should have an open immigration regime for our youth to go in the near future. So that is an important objective. The third important objective for India's trade policy is that we need access to foreign direct investment. Partly, this is about India making its FDI regime within the country as attractive as possible, and which we have been doing. But the fact remains that we do need enormous foreign direct investment for infrastructure development within the country. The fourth important objective, I would say, is access to state-of-the-art technology. It's clear that with the fourth industrial revolution, you cannot really go on to the fourth industrial revolution without access to the latest technology. So access to technology, I would say, would be the most important. Here we have two things. One, you have an inflection point when it comes to intellectual property rights and whether technology is subject to very strict intellectual property rights that India finds it difficult to access it. So that is one part of the story. The second part of India's trade policy is we will have to depend on indigenous research and whether India can try to see if frugal innovation is something that India can benefit from. I have always felt, even as a trade diplomat, that India does not need Rolls-Royce technology all the time. India, what it really needs, especially rural India, especially parts of the country which may not have the best infrastructure, we need appropriate technology. So where a Tata bus or a Mahindra truck can suffice, there is no need for India to import a Mercedes-Benz or a Rolls-Royce. And this is the way we have to go forward as well. So I will now come to some important challenges facing India. One of the questions that you may have in your mind is if, as I said, India has to join FTAs, why is it that we said no to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement? I'm anticipating some of your questions, and it's good to know what made India do this. The fact of the matter is, I take you back to the Mahatma Gandhi Litmus test. I take you back to India's government and its steadfast acquisition for policy space. With the RCEP, our main problem was how to handle China and especially import surges from China. There is a concept of import surge in trade policy. That is, if you are importing, let's say, 100,000 tons of, hypothetically speaking, palm oil, and suddenly year to year, you find there is an import of 200,000 tons of palm oil. That is called an import surge in trade terms. And in every trade agreement, you have a provision so that the government can tackle this import surge through what is known as safeguard measures. So it is the question of import surge and the safeguard measures vis-a-vis Chinese imports that India really could not get satisfaction from its RCEP partners. The other important aspect of India's trade policy is there are some red lines in India that you simply or no democratically elected government can afford to ignore. One of them is subsistence farmers and agriculture. So if you're going to have free imports of dairy, for example, from Australia or New Zealand, then your farmers are in a situation where they simply cannot cope with import of milk powder, import of dairy products, or import of wheat and rice. So agriculture and subsistence farming in India, I would argue, is a red line that no government can afford to cross, especially keeping in mind that 50% of employment is directly or indirectly dependent on agriculture in India. So that's the first red line. The second red line, I would say, is sectors like the steel industry or the auto industry, which provide mass employment in India. At a time when jobs are under pressure, at a time when the economic growth in India is slowing, this is another red line. We have to protect our domestic industry, especially those which provide mass employment. But subject to these two caveats, which I pointed out, I am in favor of Indian domestic industry being made subject to competition for the simple reason, and I hope I'm not going to say anything controversial, I believe Indians are reformers under compulsion, not by conviction. I think everybody knows we reformed in 1991, but we reformed in 1991 because the country was broke. We really had no choice but to reform. So I would say that subject to these red lines, it's not a bad idea to tell the Indian industry that, listen, India needs to get on to those global value chains. We need to attract foreign investment. We will give you a reasonable transition period of 10 years, which we would have got in the RCEP. In fact, for tariff decreases, I think we were about to get even 20 years. I mean, it'll interest some of you to know that even advanced countries like Japan and South Korea, which recently have negotiated an FTA, their transition period is 20 years. So even an economy like South Korea, which is very, very advanced compared to India, wants a transition period of 20 years to bring their tariffs down to zero. So my point is, sooner or later, subject to these two red lines, Indian industry must be made subject to competition. It is only then that Indian industry will become more competitive. It is only then that India will fulfill the objective of getting on to the global value chains. And bear in mind that today, I'm sorry to say, we are simply not a major part of the global value chains. That's one of the major problems that we face. But I also want to say that most of international trade in the future, regardless of President Trump, is going to be dependent on FTAs. There are some major free trade agreements in the world which are going to set standards. One of them is the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. The other is the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. The third, obviously, would also be RCEP. I want to underline that the last word on RCEP has not been said yet. India has made it clear that if negotiations can continue and if India's concerns can be substantially met, then India will be happy to join RCEP. But the point I am making is international standards on trade are going to be determined not by the WTO, but by these big mega FTAs. What are these standards? One important standard will be technical barriers to trade. I mean, you might have heard of this expression, but any product is subject to technical barriers to trade, which are considered legitimate by the WTO. So these may have to do with the quality of the product. These may have to do with the safety of the product. These may have to do with other standards. These are not illegitimate barriers. More importantly, for India's export of vegetables, fruits, and animal products, sanitary, phytosanitary standards are the biggest obstacle for India. Again, these standards are something that our products must face. For example, 3-4 years ago, I remember when I was India's ambassador in Paris, the entire consignment of mangoes from India had to be sent back because they found one germ or something, some residue, some chemical residue in the mango was not acceptable for the EU. Buffalo meat, same problem. So it is vitally important for a country like India, which wants to get to the 5 trillion stage, the economy being 5 trillion, which wants to double its exports. You cannot do it unless your vegetable and animal products meet world-class standards. These standards will increasingly be set by these free trade agreements, which is why, whether you are part of the free trade agreement or not, my advice to the Commerce Ministry, the Government of India is, we must closely monitor the TBT, the SPS in these free trade agreements, try to match them by making autonomous changes, if possible, within our trade ecosystem. Lastly, I also believe that there are reforms that need to be done within the country. I think it's fair to say that a lot of reforms has happened in the last 5.5 years, but more remains to be done. One clearly is the area of land reforms, where I think the government will have to work, because we live in a federal polity. It's not just up to the central government. The central government will have to work with the state. The other area where I believe we need to undertake deep reforms is labor. The labor reforms are also crying out for attention in India. Again, this is something the central government must need to do with the state. So these reforms are important because they form the hard infrastructure of trade policy. The soft infrastructure of trade policy are international rules, the rules that you have from FTAs and WTO. The hard infrastructure is how your ports are going to function. Do you have enough ports in your country? Do we have enough ports, airport freight capacity? Do we have enough customs people so that trade facilitation can happen within a short period of time? It is simply now unacceptable for any product to take more than 2 weeks at a port. I mean, Singapore clears it in 48 hours. So obviously, if Indian ports take more than 48 hours, we are already at a disadvantage. So I think the reforms that are going to happen within the country are also important. Let me perhaps address the last segment of my intervention, and thank you for your attention, on the new aspects of trade policy. One of them that cries out for attention is e-commerce, electronic commerce. Now, this is something most of you are aware of, because I can't imagine addressing anyone who hasn't ordered anything through Amazon or Flipkart or whatever. The fact is, the WTO current rules are supremely inadequate to deal with this subject. When we negotiated the Uruguay round and the Doha round, and I was India's negotiator in both those rounds, we never thought e-commerce will come to dominate the commercial landscape like this. So obviously, we did not frame rules for this. The only thing the WTO was keen to do was to make sure that there would be no customs duty on electronic transmissions. So one of the reasons why you are all able to access e-commerce easily is because there is no customs duty on an electronic transmission. But my point is, you have heard the saying, data is the new oil. So your buying behavior, your behavior of watching programs on television, your behavior of the friends you are seeing, what you are ordering and eating from Zomato, wherever, these are all data. This data is dependent on three things. Where is data originated? Where is data processed? And where is data monetized, and who owns the data? So this is the complex world of e-commerce. Now, India, as always, is in a sui generis place, because on the one hand, you have the United States, which has got these major tech companies, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple. On the other hand, you have China, which does not allow these companies to operate in China, but it has its own giants, Alibaba and Tencent. And in the middle, you have two major spaces. One is the European Union, the other is the Indian economy. Europe and India are generating masses of data right now, but we have not really owned this data yet. Especially India, we do not have yet a global regulation for e-commerce. We have a draft bill on e-commerce. We have certainly asked for comments from the public, but the parliaments are yet to pass a detailed legislation on e-commerce. I put it to you for consideration that the future of the fourth industrial revolution and how India will face will ultimately be dependent on e-commerce. And on e-commerce, India has some tough decisions to make. I will mention three, and then I will finish so that you can ask me some questions if you like. So one important question is basically whether we should have a privacy law on who owns the data. And this is important because the European Union has come up with a general data regulation, and we may follow suit with something similar. The second important aspect with regard to e-commerce will be whether India can insist on data localization. That is basically critical personal data with regard to Indians should be housed in the country. So these are some of the issues on e-commerce, and maybe I should stop here and then allow you to ask me questions. But once again, India is at a very decisive moment in its trade policy, where I think some important decisions need to be taken by the government so that we can move forward. Thank you for your attention.
Master Kumar, you have given quite Master Kumar, you have given quite a talk because we have a lot of questions for you. So I will read out the questions for you, and then would you like to take it one by one, or should I read them all out?
One by one is better.
So the first question from our audience today is, how do you see upcoming trade agreement with USA in the near future?
Okay, so that's an excellent question. I want to underline that I said the three major economies of the world are US, EU, and China. We do not have an FTA with any of them. With the United States, the intention is to have a limited trade deal. It's not going to be an FTA, because you will understand and appreciate that a free trade agreement with the United States will take a long time. So this is going to be a limited trade deal. And I think it will focus on two or three things. I don't belong to the government, so I'm not in a position to second guess the exact negotiations. The one issue would be US decision to withdraw the generalized system of preferences for India, the GSP. US has said that we do not consider India a developing country. So that is one issue that needs to be resolved. The second issue that needs to be resolved is, can India try and address the trade deficit problem that the United States has been telling us? And finally, we would also like to see in the limited trade deal with United States how investment can be addressed, especially critical US investment in India.
My question is, out of USA, Europe, Middle East, and China, which zone would be priority number 1, 2, and 3?
So my priority, and that's a good question, by the way, my priority would be US and EU, for the simple reason that the way I see Indian exports and the strengths of Indian exports, these are essentially pharmaceuticals, IT, you've got the traditional areas of garments, tea, coffee. I personally think for the foreseeable future, the West is likely to be a market for India's exports. Hopefully that will change. And at some point, hopefully India will export far more to China than it imports. But that is not a scenario that I foresee in the short term. So I would focus on US, EU. The Middle East is an interesting region. Basically, the UAE, Saudi Arabia is what we need to tackle. The others are small countries, Oman, Bahrain, and so on. But if we can get hold of these big markets of Saudi Arabia, UAE, where we export quite a bit, and a lot of it is also transit trade. I mean, India uses Dubai as a transit point to export to several other locations in the world. So I would say US, EU, the Middle East, but China, for the foreseeable future, I do not see us exporting more to China than import.
So moving on to the next question. Is Indian domestic industry ready for competition, especially MSME sector, which is facing liquidity issues, with banks becoming extra cautious with historic NPLs?
So that's again a very, very tough question. I made a somewhat controversial statement, but I stand by it. If you ask any company, MSME or a big company, do you love competition? Will you just pick up by your boots? The immediate answer anywhere in the world is going to be in the negative. Nobody likes competition because you're doing well, you're exporting. Why would you face competition? But then you are getting into a world of globalization where standing still is not an option. What will happen is if you do not face competition, you will lose even the existing markets tomorrow of what the economists call creative disruption. Creative disruption is going to be the name of the game. And you've got automation challenges, you've got robotic challenges, you've got technological disruptions. So I think the only way is to tell our companies that they need to face competition, they need to access state-of-the-art technology. Without that, they will perish anyway. So I would definitely say that companies have no choice now except to face competition.
So our next question is requesting you to elaborate a little more on the labor reforms required within the country.
So, as I said, I will make some carve-outs from my prescription. One carve-out would be agriculture. So whatever I'm about to tell you by way of prescription will not apply to agriculture. The other carve-out I will do is for massive sectors of the economy which are mass employers. If thousands of people are employed exactly, for example, in the pharmaceutical sector or in the auto sector, then I would deal with those differently. I mean, I would expose them to competition, but perhaps gradually and incrementally. The third exception I would have is obviously if you're in the khadi industry, if you're in the small scale industry, you can be protected, but even those, you will have to make it clear to them that it is going to be for a finite period. No, this can't go on for 50 years. You cannot guarantee a small scale sector company in India for the next 50 years you will be protected. You can't. So you give them enough time, you serve them notice that, listen, in 10 years, please shape up. Otherwise, you will have a problem. So if we make this clear for the rest of the sectors, I genuinely think that we need competition. You know, it's one of the saddest things of India's trade policy, and let me say this up front, is that the consumer's interest never figures in India. You see any debate on trade policy, it's always employment. It's always the producer, and you have enough chambers of commerce which will take the interest of the producer. Have you heard of important consumer lobbies? I mean, after all, if you have competition and if the price comes down, all of us benefit. All of us are consumers in this country, but nobody talks of consumers. And this is something I think that needs to change. Ultimately, when you evaluate competition, when you evaluate a trade policy, you will have to keep the consumer's interest also in mind.
Sir, the next question is, what are the domestic factors which hamper the competitiveness of Indian exports and prevent India from leveraging the preferential market access in partner countries?
So I would say three things. I would mention land and labor straight away. I mean, if a foreign company has to come here and spend 2 to 3 years trying to acquire land for greenfield investment, I'm sorry, their automatic inclination will be to move to another country where it can be done in a matter of months. Nobody is saying, India should be like Singapore and we should do everything in 48, 72 hours. Nobody says that. But you cannot possibly take more than a year. If you are talking serious investment, you have to clear at least two things. One, land acquisition has to be easy. Second, nobody says that you have to go against principles of sustainable development and environment. But you cannot allow a foreign investor come in and then you have people raising red flags and saying we don't want this investment because it's going to hurt villagers or it's going to hurt environment. These things have to be sorted out in advance. The other important reforms, I think, are ease to do business. I think we have made tremendous progress with regard to the ease of doing business, but I still hear investors saying there are far too many requirements, 25 to 27 requirements of certificates, even if this is a huge improvement on what has happened before. I would automatically think of electricity, power. Power has to be made available 24/7. You cannot expect a foreign industrial or even a domestic unit for that matter to have a captive power plant. That is an addition to his cost. That is something that you have to make sure the investor gets. Infrastructure in terms of road and rail transport to the nearest port or the nearest airport. This is something that simply has to be done. It is not enough to just provide him something in the middle of nowhere and then leave him to his own devices. So I think we need to get a fix on some of these infrastructural constraints and the law. I think the bankruptcy code that we have got is a huge improvement on the situation that existed before. Everybody welcomes that because everybody says, it's interesting. In India, everybody says it may be a little difficult to get into the market, but once you get in, it's okay. You can manage. But what if things go wrong? This is something we must provide comfort to the investor because things can go wrong. In real life, things do go wrong. And if it goes wrong, you're not going to seriously expect an investor to fight his case in the court for 10 years. That's simply not on. I think there we have made some improvements.
Why is India skeptical about the benefits of free trade agreements and what actions can be taken to reverse this trend?
So, one important reason why we are skeptic is because of our own lack of confidence in the competitiveness of our industry. I will say that upfront. I think everybody knows, for example, while in the IT sector we have names which are global, can you tell me one commodity or good where India is a world leader? Let's take shoes, let's take textiles, let's take garments, let's take spectacles, watches, anything. You will be hard put to think of an Indian brand which is absolutely worldwide famous. So that is the main reason. The skepticism is basically because of lack of confidence in our own competitiveness. But you will immediately see that this is a chicken and egg problem. The question is which comes first? If you are going to expose your industry to competition, they will automatically become world leaders. I mean, today in garments, we are competing not against China, but against Bangladesh, against Vietnam, against Sri Lanka. That is what is going on. And those countries have turned out to be much more competitive. So ultimately, I think Indian products will have to become absolutely world class. Now, one important dissuasion for Indian manufacturers, because our domestic market is so big, there is no great temptation to export. That has changed now. But 10, 15 years ago, if you would ask a shirt manufacturer like Zodiac, they'll say, why should I export? There is a tremendous market in the country, so I can sell. That still applies, I think, to a number of industries. So I think it's got to do really with the competitiveness factor, the technology factor, and really this desire to go out of the country and conquer markets abroad.
I also have questions on international trade here. So is data storage in Indian servers better for India? And how Indian small traders can be protected from global e-commerce giants? And the same person has one more question. Any suggestion how India can be made more efficient in logistics, including port congestions?
So I think the first one, it's a very, very tough question. I personally think some element of data must be stored in India. And I will explain what I mean by that. I think for those of you who are interested more on this subject, take a look at the Sri Krishna Committee report. It's a report which is very detailed. And also take a look at the draft bill floated by the Ministry of Commerce on e-commerce, the policy on e-commerce. The point is this: if there is a person who has got critical personal data and non-personal data. What is non-personal data? The non-personal data is the pair of shoes that he or she gets, or the perfume bottle that he or she has bought. Is she using more Amazon than Flipkart? This is non-critical, non-personal. Personal data would be what are his or her religious beliefs? What are his or her beliefs on abortion? what are his or her beliefs on homosexuality. These are critical personal data, data on religion, data on political beliefs, and so on. These data, I believe, or bank statement, for example, the bank statement, this data, I believe, must be stored in India, or at a minimum, they call this mirroring of data. That is, you have some data, maybe Mark Zuckerberg stores the data, but you keep a copy of it in India, so that at least if you need it, you need to access it. This also applies, by the way, to people who are fugitives from justice. When the government of India needs data about people who have taken huge bank loans, defaulted, and got the hell out of the country, then the government of India needs those data. Right now, it is becoming very difficult for the government of India to access it through Google and all that, because they say there are privacy considerations. We cannot share it with you. So I think it's fair to say that critical personal data must be stored within the country. The huge question is, what constitutes personal data and what constitutes not personal data? That's a matter of debate. On the logistics in India, I think we have made progress, but logistics is essentially about roads, electricity, and your procedures. This is all there is to it. If you have good infrastructure, if you have 24/7 power, and if you have people who do not think that rules means you object to people and ask people why you are doing this, why you are not doing this. If the role of the customs and the bureaucracy is to facilitate business, not to obstruct business. If you have that in place, already logistics would be much, much better. By the way, people don't expect India to be like Singapore. Don't ever get into that notion, because people know that India is different. After all, Singapore's market is not the same as India's market. So India has got enormous advantages. It's just that people don't want their life to be miserable in getting these permissions and, in transferring their goods from point A to point B. For example, take a simple, this is a difficult one to solve. Trucks in Delhi only have a limited number of hours in which they can traverse through the city. This is already adding to your time, your logistics time. If you're a businessman, and if you're a foreign investor in India, you want to make the goods in Noida, you want to transfer it to Chennai. Already, instead of 2 days, it's going to be 4 days, because your truck timings are already only 12 hours. You're not allowing them 24/7. But these are genuine problems, because our roads cannot take that much of traffic. It's as simple as that. So I think logistics has to be separated between what is possible and what is simply impossible. But I believe there are a catalog of issues on which we can make huge progress, provided the center, the state, and the Ministry of Shipping Transport can sit together and organize itself.
Dr. Kumar, there's a very interesting question from a viewer. So they're talking about the upcoming meeting of the RCEP in Bali on Feb 34, and India has again received an invitation for it. So is this the last window for India to join RCEP? Will India change its mind, or is it a strict?
So again, I don't work in the government, so I wouldn't know, but a couple of pointers, if you like. I have always felt RCEP makes no sense without India. This might come as a surprise to you, but just look at it logically. Every other member of RCEP, other than India, already have an FTA among themselves. They don't need us. China has an FTA with ASEAN. ASEAN has an FTA with Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea. India has also with Japan and Korea, but not with China. So the real problem, I would say, you must look at this as an India-China FTA. This is really that. And for the ASEAN members, there is already an FTA with India, but they want us to go further because they obviously want access to India. I have always felt after 36 years in the Indian Foreign Service that there is nothing like a last opportunity in life, and especially among nations and governments. So you will be wrong in thinking that Bali is the last opportunity. There's nothing like a last opportunity, but yes, time is running out. And I think both RCEP partners and India will have to make up their minds pretty quickly, because these things can't last forever. The window of opportunity will remain open. Certainly don't think Bali is the last opportunity, but maybe for a year, if not more. But otherwise, you will have to make up your mind. They will have to make up their mind as well and try to see if they can accommodate some of our concerns. I would say among those concerns, to answer you specifically, one is rules of origin, and this is a technical issue, but you can look it up. For constraints of time, I can't go into an explanation of it. The one is rules of origin. The other is import surge, which I mentioned. And I would say the last one is non-tariff barriers. We face a lot of non-tariff barriers for our vegetables, for our fruits, for buffalo meat, for pharmaceutical products. The regulatory approval takes forever, even in ASEAN countries. And this is a problem for us. And lastly, we would need visas for our professionals. We are not asking visas for semi-skilled laborers to go from India and work in ASEAN. But if there is an Indian engineer who's going to ASEAN to execute a project and come back, I think it is incumbent on our RCEP partners to make possible that visa. Right now, we are not getting satisfaction on that. If we get these three things, I think it should be possible for us to get on to the RCEP bandwagon.
What, in your view, boost India's economy in terms of international trade in agriculture? Does agriculture export policy address the grievances of farmers?
So I'll begin by saying I'm not an expert on agriculture, but it seems to me that some things will have to be done. One is getting your farmers to adopt the latest technology, the latest systems of irrigation, which is drip farming, the latest even GMO, genetically modified technology. I think where applicable, we must provide our farmers with absolutely the latest technology, even if the land holding is small. That's the first. The second is the food grain management system we have put in place. For example, it breaks my heart to tell you that right now there is so much of food grains in the Food Corporation of India godowns, and a lot of it is being eaten by rats and we are wasting them. So we cannot have a management system of food grains in a country like India where we have procured so much, we don't know where to store them, and that the stocks are bulging, and probably a lot of them will go to waste. That is something we need to fix. And lastly, I would say we will have to redefine somehow the fertilizer subsidies. I mean, it is not possible for any government to carry on like this. You can think of cash transfers. And for those of you who are interested, please Google articles by a gentleman called Ashok Gulati from ICRIER. He's an expert in this area. He's written a number of articles on agriculture. He has recommended some of these suggestions in the budget. I haven't been able to see the budget thanks to this program, but I hope the government listens to Ashok Gulati, because he is good. And he has certainly listed out a number of reforms that can easily be taken in fertilizers, loans for farmers, and agricultural equipment, which can make Indian agriculture more viable and competitive.
A lot more questions for you, but we're restricting them down to two because of the time constraints. The first question here is that how do you weigh the fact that India is promoting export promotion schemes on the one hand, but simultaneously imposing import barriers to some countries?
So this is not unusual. After all, if you look at even President Trump in the United States, what he's saying is, I can't afford to have this kind of trade deficit. So one of the problems in trade policy, and it's not just India or the United States, but across the board, somehow we think exports are good and imports are bad. And I think we need to get out of this logic. This is a zero-sum logic, and India is as guilty as many other countries. I would make 2 points. One, not all imports are bad. It is one thing for India to import plastic Diwali lamps made in China instead of the earthen pot Diwali lamps that are so beautifully made in India. We should be buying them. That you can ban. But you don't have to worry too much about Chinese capital goods coming into India because they are used by enterprises and they actually become more competitive and they export. So you will have to make a distinction between consumption imports and imports which are in the area of capital goods and intermediate goods, which actually help the economy grow. So that's the first point I would make. The second point I would make is just about every country in the initial stages of development, which India is, has always protected their industry and helped their industry to export. So what India is doing is something that the United States, UK, Europe did 100 years ago, but everybody did it. If you see the example of the prosperity achieved by Japan, South Korea, and China, the state has had to play an important role. One of the things in India is we have to somehow get the confidence back about how efficient our state can be. But if you look at Japan, South Korea, and China, the state has played a very important role through subsidies for exporters, through provision of infrastructure. So I would say that it is not just India. We need to provide incentives for our exporters. We need to regulate imports. I would say there is a distinction between restricting all imports and regulating imports. You need to distinguish between imports which contribute to the overall efficiency of the Indian economy and imports which are just consumption imports, the Diwali lamps that I mentioned. So if you can distinguish between the two and allow for critical imports, I think there is nothing wrong if India, after signing an FTA with ASEAN, if our imports have risen exponentially, on the face of it, I wouldn't be too worried about it. But I would look into what kind of imports. If they are just shirts, if they are just undergarments, if they are just shoes, I would worry. But if things like steel, things like palm oil, things like other essential things come in, it's not a bad thing because the Indian industry then becomes more competitive.
This is a very interesting question, and which I think most of us are interested in, is the mandate of the World Trade Organization, as we see it's diminishing, and subsequently we see the rise of regional trade organizations as well as countries becoming extremely protectionist. Do these three things have a link with each other?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I hope your viewers know that I spent a good 10 years at the WTO as India's negotiator, first at the GATT and then the WTO. I mean, there is a direct linkage because the multilateral trading system has failed to deliver. The WTO has failed to deliver. So the countries have opted for free trade agreements. And to some extent, it is a cause and effect. Some people would argue that countries, when they sign FTAs, they actually undermine the multilateral trading system as well. So there is a bit of truth in both. But right now, I would put the blame squarely on WTO's inability to negotiate, inability to rule on disputes. The crown in the jewel of the WTO was the dispute settlement mechanism, which we so painstakingly constructed in the Uruguay round and then in Doha. That is now gone for a six, you know that. So we are entering now a very fragmented multilateral trading system where might is going to be right. It's a bit of the law of the jungle, if you like. And people are going to sign bilateral deals. So Jagdish Bhagwati, the famous economist, talked of the spaghetti bowl for agreements, but this is not spaghetti bowl. I don't know how to describe it. This is spaghetti bowl multiplied 100 times. It's a real mess right now. And I would say the questioner is absolutely right. I think there is a link between WTO's failure to perform and the country's proclivity or inclination to sign non-MFN free trade agreements.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kumar. It was a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to hear you for breaking down such complex matters so into such simple terms and so eloquently as you always do. And I'm sure our viewers have had a great session with the number of questions being a testament to the interest that you have generated in your talk. And we hope to hear from you again and again always.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you.